I can't help but recall that disturbing image. John Wayne Gacy, dressed as Pogo the Clown, smiling for the cameras at children's parties, surrounded by laughter and applause. Who could have imagined that beneath that colorful makeup and cheerful appearance lurked one of the most sinister minds in the criminal history of the United States? A man who, behind his costume, hid a deep and terrifying darkness. I've always been fascinated by how some people can lead a double life so convincingly. It's chilling to think about how Gacy managed to deceive everyone, his community, his friends, even his own family. He was the model neighbor, the man who organized charity events, and the businessman who seemed to have his life under control. But the truth behind those masks is far more unsettling than any horror movie could portray. I tell you all this because it's almost impossible to grasp the magnitude of the evil that dwelled within John Wayne Gacy. From the outside, no one would have suspected. How could a man who made children laugh during the day become an unrelenting monster at night? What drove Gacy to murder 33 young men and teenagers, many of whom were buried beneath his own house? It's a mystery that has left many wondering, how did he get away with it for so long? But before we delve into the horrors that Gacy committed, it's crucial to understand the context. What led him to become such a ruthless killer? Is it possible that it all began much earlier, in his childhood and youth, where the first signs of his monstrosity were there and visible to those around him? What we're about to explore is not just the story of a serial killer. It's a journey into the depths of a disturbed mind, a man who knew how to take advantage of the system, of people, and of his position to hide the most terrifying truth. Because in the end, what's most frightening about John Wayne Gacy is not only what he did, but how he did it without anyone discovering it until it was too late. Thus begins the story of the killer clown who terrorized Chicago and left an indelible mark on the criminal history of the United States. The childhood and formation of John Wayne Gacy, a monster born or created. To understand how someone like John Wayne Gacy became one of the most infamous serial killers in history, we must go back in time, to the days when everything seemed normal, or almost. The question I always ask is, was Gacy born with that darkness inside him, or was it something that developed throughout his life? Gacy grew up in a modest home in Chicago, in a working-class family. And although from the outside it might have seemed like an ordinary childhood, things at home were not what they appeared. His father, John Stanley Gacy, was a harsh, strict man who didn't hesitate to punish John Jr. both physically and emotionally. Beatings and insults were almost a daily occurrence. Gacy's father called him weak, useless, and those words stuck in young John's psyche like thorns. Imagine growing up in an environment where, instead of receiving love, all you find is contempt and violence. It's not hard to imagine how these experiences could have shaped Gacy's mind. I remember reading testimonies from people who knew the family. They described Gacy as a shy child, someone who longed for his father's approval but never received it. The constant rejection, combined with the pressure to meet the expectations of masculinity that his father imposed, was like adding fuel to the fire of an already unstable mind. However, something even more disturbing emerged during Gacy's youth, his confusing first sexual experiences and the repression he faced in a society that did not accept homosexuality. The internal conflict between his desire to fit in and the shame he felt about his impulses was, without a doubt, another ingredient in this fatal recipe. But can his childhood really be blamed for everything that happened afterward? Here's where a question arises that I can't ignore. Was Gacy predestined to become a monster, or was it the accumulation of traumas that transformed him? It's a dilemma that many psychologists and criminologists have debated for decades. Some believe that early experiences of abuse and rejection influenced the development of violent behaviors, while others suggest that there are deeper, perhaps biological, factors that predispose certain people to evil. Gacy tried to build a normal life despite his inner torment. He got married, had children, and attempted to be the family man his father had always wanted him to be. But beneath that facade of normality, something dark was already taking root. At the same time that he sought acceptance and success, he began to develop a double life, one that would take him down the darkest path imaginable. I think about how people often talk about monsters as if they were creatures alien to our reality, but the truth is that sometimes monsters are shaped by their environment. And in Gacy's case, his childhood was, in many ways, the first step toward his inevitable descent. However, that doesn't justify what he did. It doesn't excuse the horror he unleashed. So, was John Wayne Gacy born the monster he would become, or was it something that grew inside him like a slow, silent infection? The answer is unclear, but what I do know is that the demons of his childhood never went away. On the contrary, those demons stayed with him and eventually became part of his identity, turning a broken man into one of the most feared killers of all time. This is just the beginning of a story as terrifying as it is fascinating, where the wounds of the past intertwine with a series of brutal crimes that would leave an indelible mark on the history of the United States. The Secret Life of Gacy, Businessman, and Pogo the Clown. Sometimes, it's hard for me to believe how someone like John Wayne Gacy could lead such a double life. From the outside, he seemed like an ordinary man, a successful businessman who had built a solid career and a seemingly normal family. But beneath that facade of normalcy, a monster was hiding. A man who, behind his smiles and kindness, concealed a darkness that few could have imagined. Gacy wasn't just known as a respectable businessman, he was also active in his community. He owned a construction company called PDM Contractors. Who would have thought that while building houses, he was also building an image of himself, a calculated and manipulative image? Most people who knew him at the time described him as charming, charismatic, someone always willing to help. He was the kind of person who made you feel like you could trust him. And they did. I remember reading testimonies from those who worked with him, describing Gacy as a generous boss, someone who gave opportunities to young people without experience. But now, with the benefit of time and the revelation of his crimes, one realizes that those opportunities were not altruistic. Gacy had a hidden purpose. He used his business as a front to lure vulnerable young men, those who, due to their circumstances, were less likely to be missed if they disappeared. He was a predator in the truest sense. And if that wasn't enough, there was an even stranger side to Gacy. At night and on weekends, he transformed into Pogo the Clown, a character he had created himself. He wore a colorful costume, painted his face with bright colors, and performed at children's parties and charity events. People, especially children, adored him. He was the friendly clown, always making people laugh. It's disturbing to think how, behind that painted smile and those comic gestures, there lived a mind capable of the most horrific acts. What impacts me the most about all of this is the contrast. Imagine being at a party, watching Pogo the Clown juggle or make balloon animals, having no idea that this same man had a basement in his house where he committed unspeakable crimes. To me, that's one of the most terrifying aspects of John Wayne Gacy, his ability to hide his true nature in plain sight. He wasn't a loner or someone living on the fringes of society. No, Gacy was at the center of the community, attending events, chatting with neighbors, participating in political campaigns. He even had his picture taken with influential politicians, as if nothing was wrong. I wonder, what went through his mind when he put on the Pogo costume? Did he see himself as some kind of actor, switching from one role to another, from respected businessman to harmless clown, and then to ruthless killer? The ease with which Gacy alternated between these identities is undoubtedly one of the most baffling aspects of his personality. Perhaps the most chilling thought is how his victims saw him before everything changed. For many of the people who crossed paths with him, Gacy was nothing more than a kind man, the boss who offered them a job, the friendly neighbor who dressed up as a clown to entertain children. But inside, he was planning every move, carefully constructing that secret life that would allow him to hide the horror he was committing for years. How is it possible for someone to live such a life, deceiving everyone around them? It's a question that continues to haunt me. Perhaps the key lies in his charisma, and that innate ability to manipulate and lie without raising suspicion. Or maybe, and this is a more unsettling theory, he simply enjoyed the sense of control that living a double life gave him. Because at the end of the day, Gacy wasn't just a killer, he was a master of deception. Let's take a moment to think about what this says about human nature. If someone like Gacy, with his facade of success and normalcy, could hide so much horror, how many other people might be doing the same? This is the question that always lingers when we talk about John Wayne Gacy. How was it possible for someone like him to deceive so many people for so long? Gacy's crimes, a horror hidden beneath the house. As I delve deeper into the story of John Wayne Gacy, the question that always lingers is, how did he go unnoticed for so long? His public life was just a facade, a carefully crafted mask to hide the horror lurking beneath his own house, literally. Gacy committed his crimes in the close proximity of his home, a place that to anyone else would seem safe, a family refuge. But in reality, his house in the suburb of Norwood Park, Chicago, became a tomb for at least 29 young men, who never imagined that the man offering them a job or simply a friendly conversation would lead them to their deaths. What's even more chilling is that many of these young men initially trusted him. As I mentioned before, Gacy had an innate ability to attract those who were vulnerable, either emotionally or financially. He often offered them jobs at his construction company, but what awaited them was unimaginable. In his house, Gacy had what he called his fun room, but in truth, it was a space for terror. I recall reading about his modus operandi, and it still amazes me that someone could commit such atrocities with such coldness. Gacy would deceive his victims with promises of employment, parties, or simply a casual outing. Upon entering his home, he would offer them alcohol or drugs, and once they were more relaxed or out of it, he would convince them to participate in games that always ended the same way, handcuffed and vulnerable before the monster he hid inside. One of the most disturbing aspects of his crimes was how he used deception as his main weapon. Gacy had a trick he called the handcuff trick. He would show his victims how he could quickly escape from the cuffs, but what they didn't know was that when it was their turn, there would be no escape. For Gacy, this wasn't just an act of physical domination, it was an exercise of psychological power. In that moment, he had absolute control. After subduing his victims, he tortured them in unimaginable ways. Many of them were strangled, a method Gacy preferred because, according to him, it was more personal. I can't even begin to imagine the terror those young lives must have felt, trapped, with no way out, as the man they thought they knew revealed himself as a sadistic monster. For Gacy, the suffering of his victims wasn't an accidental consequence of his actions, it was something he deliberately prolonged and enjoyed. And then, the true horror, what he did with their bodies. To hide his crimes, Gacy used the space beneath his house, a place that would become a macabre symbol of his reign of terror. Under his house, in what's known as the crawl space, Gacy began burying the bodies of his victims. This practice continued for years as the number of missing young men in the city grew, and no one imagined that the responsible party lived so close. The most terrifying detail is that, despite the increasingly obvious smell of decomposition, Gacy managed to deceive his neighbors and visitors. He told them the smell came from plumbing problems or dampness in the basement. He even hired workers to do renovations in his home, who never suspected that beneath their feet, dozens of bodies were buried. How can someone live with such horror? That's the question that haunts me the most. Gacy continued with his life, attending social events, running his business, and performing as Pogo the Clown, all while the remains of his victims accumulated beneath his house. Did he feel any remorse? Or did he perhaps enjoy the secret he kept, knowing that no one suspected what was truly happening in his home? And then, when there was no more space in the crawl space, Gacy began disposing of the bodies by throwing them into the Des Plaines River. As if burying the victims under his house wasn't enough, he started seeking other means to continue his killing spree. In total, it's believed that Gacy killed at least 33 young men between 1972 and 1978, and only 29 of them were found on his property. It's shocking how a man could commit so many crimes over such a long period without being discovered. Although the police received several reports of disappearances, it wasn't until much later that they began to connect the dots. Meanwhile, Gacy continued living his double life, as if nothing had happened. I keep asking myself how someone like Gacy could deceive so many people for so long. Was it simply his ability to manipulate, to present himself as a model citizen? Or was it that, deep down, people didn't want to believe that someone so close to them, someone so normal, could be a serial killer? That is the true lesson from the story of John Wayne Gacy, that evil doesn't always present itself in obvious ways. Sometimes, the monster is right in front of us, disguised with a smile and a clown suit. The capture of John Wayne Gacy, the end of the nightmare. I can imagine the mix of relief and terror that must have flooded the investigators when they finally realized who John Wayne Gacy really was. After so many years of disappearances and rumors circulating around the streets of Chicago, it was hard to believe that the exemplary citizen, the man who organized neighborhood parties and dressed as a clown to entertain children, could be the same monster responsible for the disappearance of more than 30 young men. The key to his capture began with the disappearance of Robert Piest, a 15-year-old boy who worked at a local pharmacy. On December 11, 1978, Piest disappeared after telling his mother that he was going to meet a contractor who had offered him a well-paying job. That contractor was John Wayne Gacy. Piest's case was the turning point. The young boy's parents, desperate to find him, pressured the police to investigate all possible leads. This is where Gacy's luck began to change. Unlike his other victims, Robert was a young man with a stable life and an active family that wouldn't rest until they got answers. The police began tracing Piest's last movements, which led them directly to Gacy. At first, Gacy cooperated with the police, as if he had nothing to hide. He always knew how to present himself as friendly and convincing. However, as the investigation progressed, inconsistencies in his story began to surface. The police obtained a search warrant for his home, and while they didn't immediately find the bodies, they came across several personal items belonging to the missing victims. I remember reading how Gacy, increasingly cornered, tried to keep manipulating the situation. More than once, he seemed confident that he could continue deceiving the investigators, as he had done for years. But this time, the pieces began to fall into place. One of the most striking scenes in this process was when Gacy invited detectives to his house for dinner. As if nothing had happened, the officers sat in his dining room, talking with him while the putrid smell of decomposition wafted up from the basement. That smell was what finally triggered alarm bells. One of the detectives, unable to ignore the strong stench, associated it with decomposing bodies, something he recognized from his experience in other cases. At that moment, they knew they were dealing with something much bigger than they had imagined. With this new evidence, the police kept constant surveillance on Gacy. As the pressure mounted, Gacy began to unravel. Once a self-assured man, he started showing signs of nervousness. He knew his days of freedom were numbered. In one of the strangest episodes of the investigation, Gacy confessed his crimes to his lawyers, detailing the horrors he had committed. He told them how he had killed his victims, buried them in the crawl space under his house, and thrown some bodies into the river. What followed was inevitable. On December 21, 1978, the police returned to his home with a second, more detailed search warrant. That was when they discovered the first bodies buried in the crawl space. What they uncovered wasn't just a secret graveyard, but evidence of a disturbed mind, a mind that had turned his own home into a tomb for dozens of young men. The scenes the officers found in that house were so horrifying that many of them needed therapy afterward. The capture of John Wayne Gacy not only marked the end of his murders, but also brought an end to the suffering and uncertainty of dozens of families who had lost their loved ones. The news of his arrest quickly spread across the country, and his trial became one of the most publicized of the time. Gacy, the man who had lived a double life for so long, would finally be exposed to the world for what he truly was, a monster. I remember that in the reports from that time, the predominant feeling in the community was a mix of relief and horror. Relief because they had finally caught the man who had caused so much destruction and pain. Horror because they never imagined that the monster they had feared so much had been so close to them, hidden behind a smile and the disguise of a clown. Gacy was sentenced to death on March 13, 1980, and although his execution did not take place until 1994, his capture put an end to one of the darkest chapters in Chicago's criminal history. In the end, what has always stayed with me from this story is a chilling lesson that evil, in its most terrifying form, can hide in plain sight, disguised as something as harmless as a smile. The trial and conviction of Gacy, justice for the victims. When John Wayne Gacy's trial finally began, it felt like the entire country was watching, holding its breath. It was almost unreal that the man who had lived among society for so long, organizing parties and participating in charity events, could now be sitting in court, accused of the most unimaginable crimes. The families of the victims attended, hoping to find some kind of solace, some answers to the questions that had haunted them for so long. I remember how the media covered every detail of the trial. Gacy, dressed in his suit, appeared calm, almost indifferent. But there was something in his eyes, a coldness that sent chills down your spine. He tried to defend himself by pleading insanity, claiming he wasn't responsible for his actions. But the testimonies, the evidence, and the sheer weight of his crimes were overwhelming. There was no doubt that this man, who once dressed as a clown to make children laugh, had committed unspeakable atrocities. The prosecution presented a meticulous case, detailing how Gacy had lured his victims, all vulnerable young men, and then killed them with a cruelty that defied comprehension. The testimony of investigators and forensic experts was devastating. Time and again, the conditions in which the victims had been found were revealed, many of them buried in the very place Gacy called home. Gacy, for his part, remained unshaken. His attempt to appear eloquent and composed only added to the horror. His coldness, his lack of remorse, was almost as chilling as the crimes themselves. One of the most painful moments came when the victims' names were read aloud. The faces of their families, some of them present in the courtroom, reflected a deep sorrow, a wound that would be difficult to heal. Finally, after weeks of testimonies, evidence, and arguments, the jury deliberated. When they returned with the verdict, no one was surprised. John Wayne Gacy was found guilty of 33 counts of murder, and the judge sentenced him to death. It was an inevitable verdict, but also insufficient. No sentence could bring back the victims or completely ease the pain of their families. However, there was a sense of justice, however delayed. The monster who had terrorized Chicago was finally facing his fate. As I reflect on the story of John Wayne Gacy, I can't help but feel a mixture of disbelief and horror. How is it possible that a man like him, seemingly kind and active in his community, could hide such a dark and monstrous side? Gacy didn't just deceive his victims, he deceived society as a whole. He made us believe that evil always had a recognizable face, when in reality it can be hidden in someone who smiles, organizes charity events, or dresses as a clown to entertain children. The Gacy case makes me question many things about human nature and our ability to detect danger. For years, he lived alongside his neighbors, worked as a respected contractor, and presented himself as a family man. No one imagined what was really happening in his home, a place that hid the bodies of innocent young men beneath its foundations. And I think about those lives cut short, about the families who still live with that pain, and I wonder if we will ever truly understand what happened. This case also forces us to think about how justice has been handled in other similar situations. Gacy was arrested several times before finally being discovered, meaning there were missed opportunities to save lives. The system's failure to identify and stop him before his crimes reached such a scale is a deep wound in our trust in the institutions designed to protect us. But what does all of this teach us? For me, the biggest lesson is that we can't afford to be complacent. Gacy's case shows that true darkness can lurk anywhere, even where we least expect it. It reminds us that we must always be vigilant, that evil isn't always obvious, and that those who embody it can be masters of deception. However, it also reminds me that, despite the horror, good ultimately prevails. In the end, Gacy was captured, tried, and convicted. Justice, though slow, finally came for the victims and their families. Although the damage can never be fully repaired, society showed that it would not be overcome by terror. That is perhaps the closure we can offer to this dark story, humanity's ability to face its demons, no matter how horrible they are, and find a path to justice and truth. At the end of all this, I leave you with a question we may never fully answer. How did someone like Gacy, who seemed so normal, manage to deceive everyone for so long? Perhaps it is that very question that keeps the memory of his crimes alive, a reminder that in a world full of shadows, we must always stay vigilant for the light of truth. If this story has left you thinking or touched you in some way, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. How do you feel after hearing about this case? Do you think something like this could ever happen again?